at different banned books at Park Roads Books. Of the first Tuesday of every month, and we pick different books. We've read The Hate U Give, we've read 1984, we've read Genderqueer, we've read The Absolutely True Story, Part-Time Indian, and just recently we read D.H. Lawrence's The Rainbow, 1915 racy literature. But anyway, you all are invited. Part of the reason I'm here is because I'm in the reading group that Michelle started, and we read 1984, and I'm a professor at Winthrop, and I said, I just taught that in my British novels class. I'm happy to lead that discussion. So I'm here, I talked about it there, and I'll talk about it here. When I taught the novel, and this is the first time having seen the film, although I read about the film before coming, and I've read some claims about the film that I think I'm going to bring up with you later and see if you agree or disagree with these articles I've read. But the first thing I wanted to mention that I'm experiencing, having watched this, there are a number of theorists that talk about the difference between reading and viewing, and that sometimes seeing something is much more visceral and disturbing, even though something can be described very graphically. I just wanted to take a minute. I heard a lot of you gasping at the rats, and I too gasped at the rats. What was it like, those of you that maybe have read the book, to see the torture acted out? Does anybody want to share did you have a different reaction maybe seeing it on the screen than you did if you've read the book before in high school or college, or just anyone want to share? I feel like that needs to be addressed. Anybody? Comments?
Go for it. The torture was really horrible, of course, to watch, and that I think was always going to play out worse on screen than in the book, or potentially just as equally as bad. But to sort of change your question a little bit, I actually found the sort of conflict of the inner thought of Winston to play out much better in the book than I did in the film, because that's a really hard thing to get across over the screen. And the fact that you can hear his inner monologue in the book, and unless you're having a sort of a narrator speak throughout the entire film, you don't get that as much. It's quite hard to display that on screen, sort of watch him crack away from the party line. So torture definitely played out pretty horribly. But yeah, I thought not a perfect film for that reason, but that's just it was such an ambitious book to try and portray on the screen because of that. So much of the point of the story happens non-visually, happens inside of the main character's head.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, what do you think? Do you have? I do. I would love to hear your thoughts. Yeah.
So I agree that whereas I don't think that at least for me, since I was expecting the rats, it wasn't that shocking to me. But I think that the other torture, like the thought crime torture, was a lot more. I feel like I had a better understanding of one of the iterations of like how it could be, because since I was expecting the rats, I don't think that it shocked me. But I think seeing the other forms of torture, and then also the visualization of like the fields and his way of understanding his change in thinking and all of that, I feel like that was a lot more visceral, I guess, in that way. But I agree that obviously when the whole point of a novel is thoughts, it's obviously a lot harder, but that's why I think that in some ways it was a lot more easy to visualize, and in other ways it wasn't.
Thank you all so much for those really thoughtful answers. I think part of, just to get back to what you said, the book is so philosophical and complex, and it is a challenge to render it. There are also these plot moments that I think are emphasized by the visual, and I love your point about expectation. I knew that he was going to give Julia up before the rats actually got to him, because I'd read the book. But I think maybe if I hadn't, my anxiety level would have been especially high. It was a really traumatic kind of moment. So I hope you all go home and have happy dreams, puppies, rainbows. I think one thing that I really love about this novel, well, it's sort of a love-hate. When I teach this novel, the ending is really hard for my students. And I brought the book, and I thought I'd read just the last 4 or 5 sentences. Look at me with my book.
Lost my place. Because at the end, they have a little afterword, and we don't want the afterword. Nobody wants that. It's a long discussion of how doublespeak would work. If you want to think about language, it's very fascinating. Oh, and I need to be using the microphone, don't I? Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, you're okay.
I had it all ready with my little pieces of paper in there. Anyway,
What I was going to read that I've lost is this idea that Winston truly gives up at the end. The final line of the book is famous. He loved Big Brother. Really, he is mentally broken. Everything is lost. He has not only lost the woman he loved, he has not only lost his safety, he's potentially facing execution. He's been publicly humiliated. His body's been destroyed. He's lost teeth. He's been physically damaged. He's been starved. But he's also lost his individuality and his ability to think. He really loves Big Brother at the end. And a lot of my students want to say, but isn't there a little hope? Maybe he'll rise up again. And I'm like, no. George Orwell is responding to Stalinist Russia and Nazi Germany. This was written, he was a journalist during World War II. He had very strong feelings about fascism. And this is a warning. Everything is lost. Everything is lost. It is dark. It is a tragedy. But wait, no, it's bad. So I think that when I was looking at some things on this film, Winston, and you'll remember at the very end, writes 2 + 2 =, and then he reaches for the night. Why is that an interesting film choice? Anybody? What is the night?
The night can only move
4 spaces, right, exactly. In the L shape, right? And then he says, I love you, but is he facing the telescreen? No, he's turned the way Julia has gone. So I feel, tell me if this is a stretch, some critics believe that this particular film version is opening the door to a little bit of hope. That it's possible that Radford, our writer and director, wants to be a little less negative than the novel. What do you guys think about that? Is that a good thing? Is that going against the wishes of the original author? I mean, usually when you do an adaptation, you're pretty loyal to the ending. You can make changes, you can add things, but to me that's a bit of an interesting thing, but it's so subtle. You know, he just touches the night, he turns and looks towards Julia, but I love you. It could be directed to Big Brother. What do you guys think about those tiny little symbolic choices?
For me, the symbolism is the tears in his eyes.
Yeah.
Right? It's reminiscent of his dream of his mother. That's what I get out of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I see him not say I love you, but the expression on his face and the tears in his eyes tell me that he's still thinking independently, even though he can't say it out loud, which again is totally different than the ending of the book. So I personally don't like it, but I think it's brilliantly done. But
yeah, there's pros and cons.
Yeah.
It's an interesting choice.
I was also a little bit disappointed in the ending, not having seen the film before. I really sort of anticipated this moment where he gets shot, and from the book you would expect, you know, him to just have this look of relief or even ecstasy that finally I've made it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I really do see 5 fingers. I really do believe
I am pure, right?
right.
Mm-hmm.
And so that little bit of deep inside still some independent thinking, still some hope, really changed. I mean, to me it felt stark, and I was a little bit disappointed in the ending of the film.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to see that truly, totally broken, totally accepting Winston at the end, who was relieved finally to have made it.
That's a wonderful observation. Does anybody disagree? Or what do you think? Yeah. Thank you.
So I think the point that you said about the timeliness of the ending in Stalinist Russia versus now, I think the definitiveness of having a hard stop, like this is what you guys should worry about. We need to make sure that our character is portrayed as never getting any better, versus now the adaptation may be useful in a political climate similar to ours right now. So it might be a little glimmer of hope, just a little like tidbit at the end. So I think it could be useful, but I can understand that it's not as true to the original version. So.
Well, and I love that you brought that up, because that's kind of where I was going a little bit with this, is what is the purpose of the dystopia? We can think of our 21st century canonical dystopia as the Hunger Games trilogy by Suzanne Collins. Okay, and in that world, Katniss Everdeen rises up, right? And she is going to save the day. It's going to be difficult. It's going to result in the torture and death of many people she loves. She's going to end up with PTSD at the end of the third book, wishing, she imagines herself in a grave and her children playing on a graveyard. She's not okay, but she is able to overturn the system. Is there a value in that dystopian hero story that's different from the dystopian tragedy? Or do we need the stark, tragic, no, this is what fascism does and people can't overcome it narrative? What are your thoughts about the purpose of this kind of art? What do we need? Is that too hard? How does art work and what do we need? Just answer it at the movie theater on a random Thursday night. Do any of you like the Katniss story better, where we have hope and a hero?
I'll just chime in
Chime
and say
in.
that. I mean, so, fun fact about me. I was an English creative writing major and
Hooray.
I have never read 1984.
It's okay, it's very dark.
Sorry. But I did read all the Hunger Games books because I was a young adult and they were really popular. when I
They're
was in
very
high school.
readable.
Yeah, exactly. You could breeze through that. If I was reading George Orwell, when I read Animal Farm, I hated that. It's depressing. But I will say that the Hunger Games is like a dark, fun version of this. Watching this, seeing the ways that I could kind of draw parallels to that book's universe as well as the film adaptations, like down to their jumpsuits, down to the use of television,
Yes.
and even the very beginning of just kind of thinking of that video that they use throughout the films and books of war, terrible war. Like, it's so similar, and I think that all of these kind of like totalitarian government, almost apocalyptic story tropes are similar in that sense, because to lose your ability to just think in your own mind is hell, and like that hellscape is so similar in all those ways. So that's my rant in that sense.
I love that insight. Anybody else?
Okay, I'm so sorry to be talking.
I love it. Speak up, talk back.
But in a response, as like a Hunger Games apologist, and I'm sure you're a fan too,
Yeah.
but like I'm like big fan of Hunger Games.
I'm a fan.
Yeah, it's so good. I would say that I actually disagree because I think that, well, one, it is targeted towards young adults, but I think that's similar in the way of like The Giver is as well, where it's a really dark dystopian story, but it is targeted towards young adults. And so, and then also with the Hunger Games turning into a massive, blockbuster hit, it has to be a lot more palatable in some form because it is going towards young adults. However, I think as an adult going back and reading the Hunger Games, it actually shocks you a little bit how dark it is because there are instances of, like if you really think about it, because I read it when I was about 12, 13. So reading about a 16, 17-year-old, it's like, oh my, well, they're an adult, And then now it's like, no, those were children going to war for their whole country. And it also touches on race, it touches on classism, of course. And then there's even like in the second novel, there's Finnick who's selling his body to the, adults. So like, I think that for part of that story, and because it is for young adults, showing something as dark as it is, and then showing well, she actually doesn't become a martyr, but they were worried about her becoming a martyr, like a figure that can overcome it, does have a purpose, along with something like this, like my friend said about how showing the fully total bleak side of it has a purpose in that war scene as well, and like the political climate. So I think here, I think there's room for all of it, and like the same for like the book versus having the movie. Like that's the point of being able to make so many artistic renditions of something, is they can all exist in the same field and you can gain something out of both of them. So.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. That's great. And just to kind of throw just a final thought in there really is room for a lot of different ways to talk about broken governments and the people that suffer under them. We've got 1984, just kind of the warning piece of literature. We've got something like the Hunger Games or the Allegiance trilogy that talk about heroic dreams of overcoming a corrupt government. And then you can even talk about things like Erin Brockovich or Norma Ray, which are these kind of like concrete stories of real people that fought injustice in their own communities. All of these are like valuable pieces of art that encourage people to think deeply about their freedoms and the world they want to see. I did want to kind of, on that note, bring up, I think we get this some in the film, maybe a little more in the book. There's a ton of nudity. Hello! This 1984 film was actually made in 1984, and it felt very 80s to me, with all the nudity. Oh, hello. But I wanted to bring up some of the differences between Julia and Winston. Winston is really excited, we get this somewhat in the film, but maybe a little more in the text, to get Goldstein's book. He wants to understand how this totalitarian regime works, and has this faith that perhaps the proletariats will rise up, that there is hope, that things can be overcome. And he thinks that will happen by understanding a system. And if he understands the system, he can overthrow the system. Whereas Julia just wants to rebel every day through living a chaotic existence. She says she regularly has sex with various people, whether that's true or not. It's very rebellious for her to even claim that in this culture where they're trying to do away with the orgasm. She's stealing the coffee, getting the tea, getting the sugar, the makeup, the dress she's not supposed to be wearing. She's sleeping with an older man. She's kind of living this chaotic life as a way of rebellion, and Winston wants to imagine that maybe the people will overturn a system. What do you guys think about Orwell's decision to present these two different ways of pushing back against a culture that you feel stifles you? Any thoughts about those kind of parallels? No, that's okay. We can move on.
I wanted to, have you read the book Julia, 1984?
I've heard of it. Have you read it? I would love to hear about
I
it.
didn't, but my book club was going to do 1984 and 1984 Julia.
Yes.
And we decided it was just too depressing.
It is so depressing.
None of us read Julia.
Yes.
So I just wanted to know if anyone had, because it's Julia's perspective.
Right. I do think Winston is honorable and admirable in his deep desire to change the world he lives in. And we can kind of see that maybe in a different world he would have been a historian. Because what he's doing, I don't know if you could tell, those of you that haven't read the book, this back to, I cannot believe the effort to make this book into a film. Those of you that haven't read the book, could you tell that his job was he would get old newspaper stories and change them so they fit with what the party said happened in history rather than what really happened? He has this belief that he can just find evidence that what the party is saying isn't true, that somehow it will be meaningful and people will care that those in power are lying and that they will want to change. But he's sadly disabused of this notion. He tries to read this philosophical treatise to Julia to share with her that it doesn't matter who we're at war with, as long as we're at war, we keep the population under control because they have to produce this labor for the war effort, and also they need to be loyal to the troops. And so this is a way to keep their emotions high and controllable. But Julia falls asleep. It is a long and boring discussion of how war can be used as a tool. So I just kind of wanted to point that out, kind of the intellectual that is Winston has really good goals, but he doesn't seem to be able to implement or bring about any of his dreams for a cultural change or shift. I find that even more depressing aspect of the book and film. Any thoughts? Yeah.
I just have a question for you.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I really liked about the book is that it's so linguistics focused.
Yes.
And I went to school for linguistics, so I was so excited, that it was
double speak.
yeah, exactly. I don't know if it was just in my copy, but it has a full dictionary part.
That was the afterword that was getting in the way of me reading the final paragraph. Yes, I'm so sorry I failed.
I was just curious, as in an English professor,
Yes.
what your opinion is of that, and then the fact that it can't be addressed as much in the movie, especially with 80s sound systems. It's kind of hard to hear what they're saying,
Exactly. I love that question. I think a big part of the book, which we get some, is he has this friend who's working on this new dictionary. And I don't know if you guys caught that the dictionary used to be this thick, but we're going to make it that thick. They're trying to remove words from the language. They do say plus good a lot. In the book, they talk about removing words like bad, because if you don't have a word like bad, well, nothing is bad. Everything is good. So if you do not have the language to express a thought, that thought may no longer exist. And you get a little bit of that with their discussion of the family. If we can eradicate the desire for a family and families, people will just have loyalty to the party. And some of that in the book too also has to do with just language about attachment and groups and things like that. But certainly there's long wonderful linguistic discussions in here that I also really enjoy. One thing that's interesting in here too with the 2 + 2 = 5, for those of you that like kind of these larger questions about Orwell's vision of how this kind of fascist control would work and would be able to keep people down, Winston believes that truth is related to objective reality. 2 + 2 = 4. We should be able to observe things and know whether or not they are true. So there's a conversation in there with O'Brien where O'Brien says, if I say there's no gravity and I'm floating, I'm right. And Winston just cannot grasp that, because for Winston, truth is related to objective reality. It's measurable, it's observable. That's why these documents that he's burning are so painful for him, because it was written down what really happened, and now we're changing it, so what can be observed is limited. But I wrote this down. There's actually been a really interesting study. This is called the Ash Paradigm, and the paradigm says, Payo Kundu and Denise De La Rosa Cummins tested whether the pressure to conform could influence decisions of morality, and the experiment yielded positive results. When faced with hypothetical scenarios such as the trolley problem, Participants would frequently adjust their moral judgments and conform to the consensus of those around them, even when their initial unfluenced responses contradicted the new one. Kunder and Cummins determined that people may conform because the consensus that departs from our own beliefs introduces uncertainty, particularly the suspicion that the consensus reflects. I'm sorry, this is very academic sounding. But the point is that there's been experiments done that humans will assume they are wrong if everyone else is saying something that's different from what they observe with their own eyes. That we have a dangerous tendency to want to fall in line with what the people that are around us are saying or doing. And I think Orwell, the reason I shared that long and complex study, maybe I shouldn't have read that, but we did, we're all educated now, is I think Orwell was kind of onto that years ago after World War II, watching the ways in which people would deny the evidence in front of their own eyes in order to allow consensus to exist within a community. It's a very dangerous human tendency, and Winston is really rejecting it, but it takes a lot of energy and he's atypical. So just kind of wanted to throw that out. In addition to the language, the desire for consensus and community is another way that Orwell describes this kind of government actually working. Because some of us are like, man, that life looks like it sucks. Did you see that woman's sink? It was just full of yuck. And really, the chocolate rations, they said they weren't going to go below 30%, but they went to 25, and people are starving. And
They were up from 20.
yes, it was up from 20. That was a great lie. Gold star, Winston. You can see why he has the job he has, like that prestige. But yeah, so definitely, because I did think one thing, did you guys notice, I thought the film really showed like the poverty and bleakness of the environment. Was there anything you guys really noted? Any scene which really stood out to you? I mentioned the sink, but like anybody else have scenes where you just kind of felt, man, this civilization, it's struggling. Anybody?
The meal where they were eating whatever that was.
Oh.
And that one fellow was so brainwashed that he thought it was great.
Exactly. Yes, I love. He may not have had the word for bad, but yeah, like this idea. And Winston was the only one who could really resist it. I think that's a wonderful example. Somebody else have a hand? Any scenes? I thought the litter was interesting. What else? Yeah.
Like as a compliment to the director, I liked the contrast between all the scenes in the movie and them being in the bedroom alone when
Yes.
they all being unobserved. I think I noticed, but I'll go back and watch the movie again sometime and see. But for example, I don't think he coughed in that room once, so he was sort of kind of able to breathe for the first time. And
What a wonderful observation. Thank you for that.
It was, and just the and that's like. I wasn't offended by the nudity. I thought like it was kind of a really justified.
I think so,
I
too.
know these 80s films can sort of unnecessarily display like a lot of female nudity, just because like the male directors don't see any issue with doing that. But it's really justified, I think, in this case, because you just need the contrast between their life outside of that room where they're buttoned up in jumpsuits and everyone's wearing exactly the same thing to being completely free inside that room.
And natural, like the authenticity of it.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts on the nudity or the room space where they were able to be together? Or the green space and how like it felt in relation to the other settings?
Please, we made the comment after that I mentioned how like the nudity didn't bother me, but also I was like, why? And it's because it's the 80s. She was fully nude. He was never fully nude. Just
Totally fair.
I will say though that I was really glad that her armpit wasn't shaved.
Yeah,
Sure. Because I feel like it's always like a woman is totally hairless and perfect, but I was like, No, she doesn't have that razor.
It was
No one does.
Yeah, nobody has a razor. It was close to the 70s. So yeah, a lot of freedom. Yeah, it was exciting. It's really good.
The only thing I wanted to add to that on the bleakness was that I think there was almost a Wizard of Oz quality to the way it was shot.
Yes.
And that, 85% of the movie might as well have been black and white. And there was a little bit of color in the room with, you saw the lipstick and the dress and whatever. And then of course when they were out in the woods, that was like full Technicolor, slam over the head. Not very subtle, obviously, but very effective, I thought.
I love that observation. It does have that feel like it's two different movies, the color.
I found that the scene where he goes into the office, and I'm blanking on his name again.
Winston?
No, Winston. O'Brien. When he gets to O'Brien's office, objectively, I think, compared to offices I've been in, it was pretty standard, right? But it felt very.
Oh wait, O'Brien's, not Winston's.
O'Brien's
I was like, oh, I'm sorry.
No.
Modern American workplace cubicle.
I work in a cube farm, but I used to anyway. But the O'Brien's office, I think subjectively, it was large.
It was.
But he had a desk, he had a couple of chairs, he had sort of a couch. But it felt so opulent. Because as I was thinking about your question earlier, that office and the green space were the only scenes where it wasn't really, really bleak, all of the streets were torn up. There were just piles of debris everywhere and broken rubble, and everything was, the whole movie was very bleak in terms of visually where they're living.
I thought the juxtaposition of the positive news stories, more people are literate. All of these positive messages coming while we just see this kind of destructive, crumbling landscape. Don't believe what's in front of your eyes. Everything's going so well, So I think that's a great observation, and pairing it with like the soundtrack, kind of going over that. I thought was a really great director choice. Yeah. I have a question for you. Oh, did you have a question?
Well, I just wanted to say real quick that what you were saying, like the propaganda is saying that everything is so great when clearly it's bad. But like our propaganda now is saying everything is so bad when, maybe it's not that bad.
Well, I do think too, we live in these social media silos, right? And there's always the get out and connect with your neighbors. Learn to be a part of a human community is really important. I like that a lot. And on that note, here's a question for all of you. I wonder if in 1984, the presence of screens in this film felt oppressive, but we are so used to screens. I wonder if this film affects 2024 people in the way it affected people 40 years ago when the film first came out. What do you think about that?
I think that's interesting because the main thing that I think about when I think about this novel and movie is, and I read the novel in probably 1994. Yeah. But I think of the commercial, the Apple commercial, and the image of Julia running and destroying the screen. Yeah. And that was something that I definitely when I was in high school. I'm sure we talked about that, and now I don't know.
No, I think it's a really great thing to share. That kind of memory of it being really evocative in the 90s. But what do the rest of you think about? I feel like the scene under the bridge where there was a screen, we were supposed to be like, gosh, there's even a screen under the bridge. And I'm like, sure. Any thoughts about our own ability to appreciate what was being created in the past? Are we a little, or did you find the screens and voices exhausting? The voices to me were the worst. I was like, shut up.
To constantly have audio going and then also a picture of just someone staring at you was a lot, even with oh, well, Alexa is always listening, like that kind of stuff. It was reminiscent of that. But I did have, there's an episode of the anthology series Black Mirror where it's Daniel Kaluuya and he's like in a room filled with television screens and I mispronounced his last name. Oh, he did. And they're just like constantly watching him or advertising to him, and he always has to kind of like pay a fee to shut it down. So I feel like I relate to, like, I felt like there was an oppression just because of the constant noise that was happening, and even Winston's excitement of how O'Brien turned it off. He was like, "You can do that?" But it just kept reminding me of that Black Mirror episode and how at a certain point the main character had to just like turn off his brain and just let the advertisements roll on so that he could save up money in order to try to escape.
Weren't they like advertising porn to him?
Yeah, it was like a porno advertisement and he always constantly wanted to shut it off, but then in order to like get to that talent show portion, in order to just make a scene, he just like let it roll and became desensitized to it.
Like the opposite of this, because it's like anti-porn and then
Yeah.
Well, I think I did want to say, I love your comments, and I hope we can all take from this somewhat shocking and nightmare-inducing, no, I'm just kidding, but our film viewing, there's a lot, despite the sadness and the suffering and the failure of Winston, I think there's a lot for us to learn about the potential for human connection, even when those connections feel difficult to make in a world that's full of screens. I'm not saying, thank God, we're not here, but we do have a lot of screens. I think too, I hope we can all see this as a truth, a warning, a way to encourage us to fight for the world we want to see, whatever that world is, to feel empowered. We're lucky, we're not going to be beat up by Big Brother, right? We can go out and make a difference, right? Is that a hopeful way to end? This was yeah. I'm going to find a silver lining after 1984. But thank you all so much. I really appreciate your thoughtful feedback.